The first thing that we're going to do today is we're going to look at the number 364 lumber loader. The accessories worked like this. There was a UCS track here, which is Lionel's uncoupling and unloading track section. And when the train pulled up and the log car was positioned correctly on that UCS accessory, when you press the unload button, the logs would dump into the lumber loader like that. Then the train could go on. At some other point in time, if you wanted to bring that train or any other train with a log car around to this accessory, to the lumber loader, you would position the car here. Now we're going to turn this on, and I want you to note a couple of things. The first thing you're going to hear is this is going to emit a very low growl, and it also takes almost 15 volts and almost 2 amps to run correctly. Now as the logs go up the belt, when they reach the top, they're pushed off onto the car like that. But this accessory does not need to make this much noise, nor does it need to take that much voltage and use that much current to do its job. Another problem with these old lumber loaders is sometimes the belt would slip on the drive pulley up here. We're going to show you how to fix that too. On your lumber loader, you may notice that it's missing one or more of these stakes. And those stakes were there just as an afterthought to hold extra logs and then make the lumber loader look a little bit more effective. If you're missing that stake, those stakes are still available from part suppliers in O-Gauge Railroading magazine. The part number for that is 2411-4, and it's called post. Okay, we've removed the track in the log car and disconnected the wires and turned the lumber loader around to show you that there's 2 panels back here, but if we turn this over and look at the underside, here's the drive motor, and here's the big pulley that pulls on the belt, and there is a gear reduction box attached to this motor. Here's the belt, and here's the drive pulley, and here's the motor and the gear reduction box. And the problem that we need to get to is right in this area here. Well, the first thing we'll do is take this large panel off on the back. It's attached with 5 screws. One here, here, and lift that plate up on this end and slide it out, because right here is a clip that's holding it on. So you need to position it off of that clip and remove the panel. The next panel we need to remove is this one. Now there's only 2 screws left holding this one on. And we'll remove the last screw here and hold on to the plate while you do this because it'll fall off. Lift the plate off. And now it's important from now on that you be careful not to turn this over on its far side, because there are several axles right here that are holding on to pulleys, and nothing is holding these axles in except that plate that you removed. So make sure they all stay in, and be very careful not to tip and throw them out, because you'll have to gather them up and put them all back in place. Okay, lift the belt off of the plastic pulley, and you should see something that's very familiar to you right here. This is the very same motor that's used in many of the turbines that Lionel made in the post-war era. Therefore, it shouldn't growl and it shouldn't make all that noise. Well, there's a reason why it does, and you're really looking at it right now. The motor is always angled down, away from the gearbox. But what I have found is that the paraffin-based grease that Lionel always used in the 50s in this gearbox, when it heats up, would get very runny and actually run down the armature and onto the motor. So what we need to do is open up this motor, the gearbox, clean all the old grease out of it, clean the armature head, the brushes, put it back together, and it'll run much better. The first thing to do is to unsolder this motor lead wire. Like that, okay. And next, using a 3/8 wrench or nut driver, let's remove this sheet metal nut and lift off the plastic pulley. And now you will see a long shaft with threads on it here. We're going to take that out, and on the shaft is a tensioner spring. So once you get this removed, hold on to the spring to keep it from flying. There's the spring. And now we can remove our motor from the accessory. As I pointed out before, this is the same motor that you'll find in some Lionel motors from the 50s, but it has this gear reduction box on it right here, this big casting. So we need to get into this casting. Let's remove these two screws. There's the first one. We're going to separate the gearbox by lifting the bottom plate off, and when you do, watch this pin to make sure you don't lose it because it's hard to find once it goes out. Let's lift the bottom off. Oh, and look at all that old grease in there. We need to get in there and remove every bit of that, and we'll put some better grease in it so that it runs much better when we're done. And we're going to lift these out, and here's the trickiest one. The first one has this pin, as I pointed out before. Just lift it out and set it aside and make sure that you don't lose that pin. The next thing that comes out is this gear shaft and these two pillow blocks. They should lift straight out like this. Yeah, there they go. And the last thing that comes out is all that ugly old grease. There's no trick to this. You just get in with a screwdriver and just get as much of this out as you can. This actually isn't that bad. A lot of these that I've opened up, they're hard as candle wax, but this one's still fairly soft. The hard stuff looks like that. It's a little bit whiter in color. See it right there on the end of the screwdriver tip? Once you've gotten all the large parts of the grease out, the next thing that we're going to do is unsolder this last wire on the motor cap and remove the cap. There we go. We've got two screws, one here, the second one here. Now before you remove this cap, realize that the brushes are in here with two large springs pushing down. Be very careful as you pull this off to slowly remove it so that you don't lose the brushes. Good. These ones stayed attached to the springs very well. So let's set the brush cap aside. And we're going to pull the armature right out of the bottom, like that. Now that we've got the armature out, here's the problem. Since this motor is always tilted down, the grease that heats up in that gearbox runs down this armature shaft, when you can see it on here, and it runs down the shaft onto the motor, all the way down to the brush plate. And it deposits the grease on the brush plate, and that's why you have this loud sounding motor that needs a lot of voltage to run. Let's clean all this crud off the brush plate and the armature. To do that, you need a toothbrush and some paint thinner. Now all I'm using here is paint thinner. It's often called mineral spirits too. So if you see it in your store as mineral spirits, that's the same thing. Don't use lacquer thinner. Lacquer thinner is a completely different animal. Let's get the brush plate, and let's also get the sides and everywhere else that could have been soaking up all that grease. There's no need to scrub really hard. We're going to clean this brush plate with another tool that I'll show you in just a moment. Just use some gentle strokes. Go with the wiring. And when you get to the back side, be sure that you get the gear and the shaft like this. There. Now we'll get some paper towels. Wipe all the excess paint thinner off of this. To properly resurface the brush plate, I use this tool, and it's identified as an industrial rush eraser from Syracuse, New York. That's what the manufacturer's name apparently says that it is. I get it from Charlie's Trains in Hubertus, Wisconsin, and I'm sure it's available at other places. But the tool is built like this. When you turn this thumb screw, you see that there's several white monofilaments coming out of the other end, and these are just tightly packed bristles. Now here is the beautiful job this tool will do. Try to brush each pole of the armature plate in a rotary fashion, the same way as if the brush were going across it, as if it were spinning. But you can see in no time at all, these monofilament bristles will clean off all of the gum and the tar and varnish that's accumulated the last 30 or 40 years on this armature plate. Now in just a couple of minutes, see how much cleaner that looks? After using the brush and getting the face of the armature nice and smooth, wipe it off, and then using a toothpick, go in between each slot between the poles and clean out any gunk that might have accumulated in there. Like that. Now, take the brush plate, carefully lift the brushes out. The springs should stay attached to them, but be very careful, because if they come off, you'll spend half a day looking for them. Set them aside. Using the mineral spirits, we're going to clean this brush plate in much the same fashion that we did the armature shaft. Get some paint thinner into all the crevices, and most importantly, get some paint thinner down in the brush sockets, and using a Q-tip, swab down in there like this and get any grease out that might be holding up the brush from working properly. Like that. And last, let's get some thinner on a swab and clean the brush. And get all the old varnish off of that. Be really careful not to lose that spring. It's really easy to do right now. All you ever need here is a cotton swab, because there's nothing deeply ingrained in the tip of the brush. All we're doing is just putting some of this paint thinner on to clean off whatever varnish may have accumulated on the top and on the sides. There we go. The next thing we'll do is clean this big gear shaft, but we need to be very careful when we do it, because we want to pull this pin out and set it aside so we don't lose it. This pin is very, very important in how it drives that plastic wheel. So we'll pull it out, set it aside, and now let's clean all this gunk off. So once again, it's just a little bit of paint thinner. Scrub the teeth of the gear. Now we'll get the gear shaft that has the two small pillow blocks on the end. Remove those carefully. Set them aside. And we'll clean this one the same way that we cleaned the other shaft. Man, some of this did turn to varnish. Up to now, we've been able to get most of it off just by some light brushing, but you may have to do some real hard scrubbing sometimes to get all this old gunk off the gear teeth. Don't forget the pillow blocks. Get the grease off of all the surfaces and all the crevices, so that they'll seat properly back in the frame. And the last thing is the gearbox cap. We still have to clean all that old grease out of there. That shouldn't be too much of a job, because it's usually not packed in there on the cap that badly, because the cap hung up high and the motor and the rest of the gearbox hung down low. Now let's get the motor field and the gearbox housing clean. Same thing, we're just going to get the mineral spirits or paint thinner in everywhere, just scrub lightly and get all the old grease out. Well, we've got all of our parts clean now. Here's the motor parts, the field, the armature, the brush cap, and here's our gearbox parts that have the two gear shafts, the pillow blocks, the pulley, and the drive hardware. So we'll begin by putting the two pillow blocks onto this gear. Okay. Now, we want this gear to be on that side, so let's turn it around, and we're going to slide these in like this. There. that gear is going to come in contact with the armature shaft, which will come right through that hole. Next, install the shaft that's going to drive the pulley so that this worm gear touches the one we just installed. Now, before we put the cover on this gearbox, we need to put some grease on these gears that we just cleaned. Remember this guy? When I took you on a tour of the back shop, I showed you this, and we used it at that time to put some grease into the gearbox of an MTH locomotive. Well, we're going to use it to put some grease onto this one too. And I loaded some white lithium grease in, the same kind of white lithium grease that you can get in an auto parts store. You can find these hypodermic tubes in drugstores and some train supply houses. Now we'll put the shaft in place that holds on to the plastic pulley. There we go. And you may notice that I'm not going to put any additional grease on there because there's already plenty to take care of that gear teeth. With white lithium grease, we don't need to use nearly as much as all the grease that Lionel originally packed in here because it tends to cling to the surfaces much better. That's what's going to make this repair much better when we're done because we won't have any grease that's running down the shaft and into the motor again. Now the last thing we'll do is put the cover on this gearbox, being careful to locate the pins and the shafts all in one place. There we go. So now it's all sealed up and everything's in the way it belongs. Let's put the two gearbox screws in. Tighten them down. And now the last thing we're going to do is turn it over and slip the armature shaft right in the hole, and it should locate so the tip of the shaft is visible right here, and it is. Now we know that all the teeth are properly engaged inside the gearbox. We'll put a drop of light oil right on the tip of the armature shaft where it comes through the gearbox cover. Then we'll turn it over. Let's set that down, and we're going to get the brush cap and the two brushes and put the brushes in place. Slide the springs down in the hole. There we go. Get the second one. Okay, holding on to the motor so that the armature is down, so that the armature doesn't fall out of place. Take the brush cap, place the brushes on the face of the armature, and just slide the brush cap on through the holes like that. Now we'll turn the armature and we'll look in here and see if we can see the brushes. Yes, they're resting very nicely on the face of the armature. Now we'll put the two screws in to hold the brush cap in place. You don't need to tighten these really tight, just snug them up. Just make sure that they don't vibrate out. There we go. Now let's lift this wire out because that's got to solder back on to the brush cap right there at that lug. I've soldered the wire in place on the motor cap. Now we're going to turn this and put the black pulley on. But notice the back side of the pulley has a slot. Well, that slot is where the pin fits that we've been carefully saving to put back into this shaft. It's time to do that now, so we'll slide that in here. Like that. And then we'll line up the slot on the plate with the pin on the motor. There. It's in place. And then the last thing we do is put the sheet metal nut back on and tighten it with your nut driver. Now our assembly is complete and ready to reload into the log loader. Let's set our motor aside now and turn our attention to the log loader frame. Now let's look down at this end. And we're going to pull this conveyor belt away to show you that There are several rollers here. One here, there's one behind it here, and this one is the one that has the knurls on it because that's a drive roller. All of these rollers are on pins that lift out. They should rotate freely on the pin. If they don't, clean up the pin with a Scotch-Brite pad, the same kind of thing that you clean the top of your tracks with. Clean out the hole of the roller if that's the problem, and then replace the roller and the pin back in. There. So once you're satisfied that all the rollers are turning properly, and it looks like all of these are, then we're going to turn our attention to reassembly. The first plate that we're going to put on is the one down on the back here, this one. But before we put it on, take the time to go over this with soap and water and clean these lenses. This piece removes, if you want to remove it, by tilting it up and taking it out like that. 3 screws hold this plate on, but we only want to put 2 in right now. The first one goes here in the middle. Like that. The second one goes on the end. The reason we don't want to use the third screw is because that's the one that holds this plate and the other one on. It goes right here. We'll do that one later. Now that this plate is on, we no longer have the danger of these pins falling out and the rollers coming out. That's why it's important to get that on first. Now we're ready to remount the motor and drive mechanism for the belt. In order to mount this, we need to put this shaft and spring back in here. Now to do that, we have to remove the wheel. The reason we put the wheel on is we didn't want to lose that pin, but now that we're pretty sure we're ready to go, let's take this back off. Watch the pin carefully to make sure it doesn't fall out of that slot because it doesn't take much to lose it. This spring needs to be put on in such a fashion that it pushes against that motor to push down. To do that, we've got to wind this spring like this. Let's see if we can hold it with the pliers and slide it in place. Now, you may have to fiddle with this and tweak it a little bit to get that spring in there. There we go. And then we'll thread the shaft down. There. And now you can see from this angle the spring pushing against the motor to keep tension on the belt. There, we've just completed soldering the wire back on the motor. Now before we put this pulley on, make sure that the pin is centered. And there's one other trick that I'm going to show you too that I've done successfully with log loaders. Sometimes the belt will slip on the pulley no matter what you do. So I found that if you take 3 identical rubber bands, big ones, that are about an 1/8 inch wide, and put them on the pulley so that they're spaced evenly, and then squeeze them together toward the middle of the pulley like this. There we go. They don't have to be perfect. They'll work their way to the middle anyway. Okay. Take a look at the slot. Line it up with the pin. Put your pulley back on and turn it until it falls down in place. There we go. And now we'll put the nut back on with the nut driver. Okay, we'll reach up here, we'll pull the motor up against the spring. Roll the belt on around the pulley. And sort of position it in the middle. There we go. There, that looks good. I think we're ready to put the back plate on and finish this job up. Remember to position it so that this tab is right behind this clip, There, like that. Well, we've put all the rest of the screws in, so this will finish up the back plate. And now we're ready to test this and see how it sounds. Remember how angry this thing sounded when we had to run almost 15 volts and it required almost 2 amps of current to operate? Well, after our work, listen to this. Notice how quiet and how smooth it is compared to the way it used to be. Look at that. 10 volts and less than 1/2 of an amp. That's a dramatic improvement. Well, after the work I've done on the log loader and with that lithium grease, this actually works better than when it was new.